A very warm welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to this week's edition of our weekly morning briefings on geopolitical challenges. We are live here every Thursday at 8:30 a.m. on Zoom and available on YouTube afterwards. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Joint Director's Office here at DGAP, and it is my great pleasure and honor to be chairing this morning's briefing. Today is the 9th of November, and as you all know, it's a significant day in German history for several reasons. In 1918, Philipp Scheidemann proclaimed the German Republic from a window of the Reichstag. In 1923, we saw the failed coup by Adolf Hitler and Erich Ludendorff in Munich, and of course in 1938, we will never forget the Nazi pogrom against Jewish life in Germany that became known as the Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass, leaving hundreds dead and synagogues and Jewish property destroyed. And of course, 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and started the process of reunification. It's become kind of a routine to remember these events, and there's much more to be said on why and how they are significant. But I just wanted to point us out at the beginning and remind us, especially in these troublesome times. In the coming weeks, we will return to the violent conflict in the Middle East, as well as other geopolitical challenges around the globe. But today, we are looking once again at Ukraine and Europe. Quite a lot has happened since our last morning briefing on the subject. In military terms, the Ukrainian counteroffensive has remained somewhat less persuasive than many have hoped, albeit some success against Russia's military strength in the Black Sea. And domestically, Volodymyr Zelensky has said, amid some debate, that time is not right for elections, which would normally be held in the spring of 2024. Meanwhile, the struggle for Western support continues, and crucially, the prospects for EU accession have been under scrutiny. Yesterday, on the 8th of November, the European Commission published its update report on the accession process, indicating that Ukraine as well as Moldova, can hope for a positive vote by the EU heads of states in mid-December to start the formal accession negotiations. Now, where does Ukraine stand strategically? How firm is the support of the West? And what are we to make of the Commission's report? To make sense of these questions, we are very fortunate to have an excellent and distinguished panel this morning. First up will be our own Senior Research Fellow, Dr. András Rácz, who's at the Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia here at DGAP, and who focuses, amongst other things, on Russia's foreign security and defense policy, who previously worked at, amongst others, the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and the former Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. Good morning, András.
Good morning.
Next, we are very fortunate to have Alexandra von Nahmen, who is head of the Brussels studio of the German international broadcaster Deutsche Welle, DW, and who focuses on EU, NATO security policy and terrorism. Previously, you were a correspondent in Washington and Moscow and reported from conflict regions around the world, including Georgia and Afghanistan. It's our great pleasure to have you, Ms. von Nahmen.
Thank you so much for having me. Good morning.
Finally, but certainly not least, Viola von Cramon-Taubadel, who is a member of the European Parliament and of the group of the Greens since 2019. You are, amongst other things, a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and a vice chair of the delegation to the EU-Ukraine Parliamentary Association Committee. Previously, a member of the Bundestag from 2009 to 2013, and in this capacity, a spokeswoman of the Greens for foreign relations of the European Union. It's a great pleasure to have you, Ms. von Nahmen.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. We would like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We will kick off our conversation in just a moment on the panel and then open up for questions after about 30 minutes. So have your questions ready. If you would like to ask a question, please use the raise your hand button, or you can post it in the chat, although we much rather see your faces and hear your voices. Finally, a word of thanks to my colleagues in the events and communications teams, and above all to you, our listeners in the audience. Thanks for joining us and for making these briefings interactive and hopefully productive. Now, to start us off with a look on the military situation, András, perhaps you can kick us off with your assessment of the current military situation in Ukraine. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning again to all of you. Thank you for joining us today morning. Here in my remaining 4.5 minutes, I'm trying to address 6 different questions briefly, so this is going to be a challenge in itself. First one, as you all know, last week, Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's army, General Valery Zaluzhny, published 3 different articles on the pages of The Economist, describing the situation of the counteroffensive, as well as the challenges awaiting for Ukraine in the upcoming year or years. The Zaluzhny article was widely discussed all around the Western and also the Ukrainian press. This was the first case when a high-ranking Ukrainian official said highly critical things about the situation of the counteroffensive. The general called the situation as a stalemate. Interestingly enough, not from the military perspective in a strategic sense, but more like a military technological perspective. So when he used the word stalemate, he spoke more about military hardware than the strategic situation itself. Yet still, the article has been widely discussed as if he had called the counteroffensive or the strategic situation a stalemate. The most interesting part of the article was when he discussed the changes that the Ukrainian armed forces have to make in themselves in order to be more ready for the upcoming fights, upcoming battles. When General Zaluzhny discusses future challenges, he actually added, in an indirect way, he said several very critical things about the state of the Ukrainian armed forces, as well as of the Western military aid. So I highly recommend reading the Zaluzhny articles. Second thing, and here I'm going to show one of the maps produced by the Institute of the Study of War, is of course the situation around Avdiivka. That's the Eastern Front. Here, now you are supposed to see the map. As you see here in Avdiivka, the Russians are gradually, slowly moving forward with a pincer move, trying to create an encirclement of the settlement. Avdiivka is heavily fortified. If you see this thin black line here, Avdiivka is one of those, possibly the last such section of the front line, which has not moved since last February. In fact, the front line has been here at the eastern part of Avdiivka since 2015. So this is a heavily fortified Ukrainian settlement, and the Russians apparently tried to encircle the Ukrainian forces defending it. On the one hand, one may argue that in this war there have already been 3 cases where Ukrainian forces desperately defended a settlement, and when the time came, they skillfully withdrew from it. This was Severodonetsk, Lysychansk last summer, and Bakhmut this spring. Ukrainian forces in all 3 cases managed to avoid encirclement by skillfully withdrawing from the settlements that were about to get encircled. However, the situation in Avdiivka might get a lot more complicated, because if the encirclement progresses, and if Ukraine has to withdraw from the settlement, they will have to do it now in the winter. And the mud season is already starting, which is called Bezdarezhye in Ukrainian, Rasputitsa in Russian. So conducting a withdrawal under enemy fire, it might be a lot more complicated if they have to do it during the Rasputitsa period. We will soon know it. Russians are suffering incredible losses here, yet still they are slowly, gradually moving forward. These dark yellow territories, these dark yellow spots indicate that the territories recently gained by the Russian forces. Right now, unfortunately, I'm fairly pessimistic about the perspectives of defending Avdiivka. I very much hope I'm wrong. Third thing, Jan Stöckmann already mentioned, developments in the Black Sea Fleet, or developments regarding Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Ukraine recently managed to strike a very modern Russian warship in the docks of Kerch, in the eastern part of the Crimean Peninsula. The result is that the Russian Black Sea Fleet is forced to further move eastwards out of the Crimea. So this is one of the very few cases in military history where a country that has practically no navy, namely Ukraine, is gradually managing to push the Russian navy further back and back towards the east. The further the Russian navy gets pushed from the western basin of the Black Sea, the safer the grain corridor becomes. So the better the chances of Ukraine are to continue grain export on the sea. Another important section of the front line is, of course, what has been discussed since June. So there's the Zaporizhia front line. Here, the situation is still largely static. Russian defenses managed to keep holding up the Ukrainian offensive. Now, with the mud season starting, it's unlikely that there will be major developments taking place here in the southern part of the Zaporizhia front line. When it comes to land operations, Ukraine has been more successful in advancing around Bakhmut. The light blue territories indicate the territories regained by Ukraine. Ukraine keeps steadily advancing west of Bakhmut. The first Ukrainian units managed to reach already the western outskirts of Bakhmut. Bakhmut is important because because of political reasons, the Russian armed forces cannot afford losing it. I mean, anyways, the siege of Bakhmut has been 10 months long. This has been the longest siege of the war. So by fighting for Ukraine, for Bakhmut, it's a settlement that's politically important for both sides, not that much of military. Last two things, Ukraine managed to further develop the small raid or small presence on the left bank of River Dnipro. The Ukrainians are now in control of several sections of the left bank, but only in the depth of 1, 2, 3 kilometers. This is not yet any kind of a bridgehead. This is important to realize. So far, this is only kind of a raid. However, very recent news indicate that Ukrainians might try to develop this into a proper bridgehead, which would require some kind of a land connection with the right bank. Let it be most probably a pontoon bridge. Ukraine recently moved large amounts of air defense weapons as well as long-range artillery to the right bank, trying to keep the Russian armed forces and particularly the Air Force away from these operations on the left bank. We will see how it's going to develop. Yesterday was the first time when President Zelensky openly mentioned that for the next year, Ukraine has plans also for the western part of the Kherson region. So most probably this operation on the left bank is going to continue. And last thing, Russia already started to attack Ukraine's energy infrastructure by drone strikes, missile strikes. The difference compared to last year is that at least so far, Russia has not publicly announced that it was going to attack the energy infrastructure. However, strikes have already started. I just returned from a field trip to Ukraine, actually tonight. And together with DGAP colleagues, we conducted another field trip 2 weeks ago. In both cases, the information we heard from our Ukrainian counterparts, from our Ukrainian partners, is that they are awaiting for major Russian strikes against the energy infrastructure to start when the real cold sets in. So once the real winter arrives, this is the moment where Russia will start major strikes against the energy infrastructure. And Russians have been accumulating ballistic missiles, precision-guided missiles, and cruise missiles already for several weeks, most likely in a preparation for large-scale attacks against Ukrainian energy infrastructure. In small scale, they have started it already. The large strikes haven't yet taken place, but I'm afraid it's about to come. So that's it from me for the start. Thank you again for joining us today morning. Jan, back to you. Over.
Thank you so much, András, for these insights, however concerning they are. We've seen that the military situation is challenging, to say the least, but we also want to look at the political perspective. So, Alexandra von Nahmen, if you could give us your perspective from Brussels and take a look at how Europe's support to Ukraine has developed over the past couple of weeks and what we are to expect in light of what András has just told us.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for your time, dear audience. I would like to start very briefly with the announcement yesterday, which was an important signal to Ukraine, even though, of course, we know that this is just a recommendation put forward by Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, a recommendation to open accession talks with Ukraine. The heads of government and state in the European Union member states still need to sign off on this recommendation, even if they say yes. And we know that some of them do have some misgivings. It could take years for Ukraine to conduct those talks with no guarantee that they will be a member of the European Union at one point in the future. Why am I starting with this? I think it is an important signal. As we just heard, we are facing a stalemate on the battlefield, and Ukraine is going to face a very difficult winter. And at the same time, there are growing fears in the West and also on Ukraine that the Western support for Kiev could be waning. We just need to look at the US. We know that the presidential election is looming in the politicians' mind very largely. And the US Congress is already now having big problems not being able to agree to continue the US military assistance for Ukraine. At the same time, we are now very consumed by another war, the Israel-Hamas war in the Middle East, which is also causing fears in Ukraine. And the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was in Brussels, I think about 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and we met him at NATO headquarters where he was participating in the meeting of the NATO defense ministers. And we asked him directly how concerned he was, and he acknowledged that he is afraid that the West attention could be distracted, and that the Western support could be diverted because of the war in the Middle East. And at the same time, of course, we're also seeing some signs for the EU's unity being frayed around the edges. The European Union has promised Ukraine to provide them with 50 billion euros in the next 4 years. This promise is on the table, and yet member states have not been able so far to really agree on that. There is a question of further military assistance, 20 billion euros. That's also on the table. The Europeans are still struggling to live up to their promise to provide Ukraine with 1 million artillery shells within 1 year. The problem is that we are used to speak about, who is sort of blocking help for Ukraine, who is an unreliable partner with this regard. And Viktor Orban is very frequently named in this context. And it's true that so far he was the only European leader willing to shake hands and with Vladimir Putin and smile with him for the cameras. But we're also seeing in other corners of the European Union some kind of tiredness and disappointment with the Western support for Ukraine. We have a new government in Slovakia, and I covered the election campaign there. And I spoke with many people, especially in the regions, who are really unhappy with how the war is impacting their economy. Even though we, of course, have to say that there is a lot of Russian propaganda, especially in Eastern Europe, trying to drive a wedge between European supporters of Ukraine. But after the election in Slovakia, we now have another prime minister in the European Union who is openly questioning support for Ukraine. And just yesterday, I think the Slovak government once again reiterated that they are stopping all aid or weapons deliveries to Ukraine. One could say it's not so bad because Slovakia was among the first countries providing weapons to Ukraine, Soviet-era made fighter jets, S-300 air defense systems. And experts are saying there is not so much they could still deliver now. But as a member of the European Union, somebody you need to have on board to have unanimous decisions in the Council, and also as a member of NATO, it is important to know that also such a small country is still on board and in favor of further supporting Ukraine. And also, we are seeing some worrying signs at the EU headquarters in Brussels, but also at NATO headquarters, where we are increasingly hearing voices arguing in favor behind the scenes, not officially, not on the record, but some voices arguing in favor of at least having some sort of an exit strategy. An exit strategy that's, of course, a very difficult topic to discuss, and it is only rightly so for all the leaders to stress that it is Ukraine and the Ukrainian government that will eventually decide whether there is any chance for a talk with Russia. So far, the Russian president is not showing any signs of any kind of willingness. And so far, I think it's fair to say that Russia and its army, it's not under enough pressure to be convinced to go to the negotiating table. But I think that it's, as I was trying to show to you, it's still, it's fair to say that fears are growing, that in the longer term, the Western support for Ukraine could be fading across the European Union and, of course, also in the US. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your initial remarks. That's fascinating insights. And now I would like to turn over to Viola von Cramon as a member of the European Parliament and as someone who has spent time in Ukraine on several occasions. We are thrilled to hear your assessment of the situation and especially of the EU accession process.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jan, for having me this morning. Indeed, a lot has happened in Ukraine since the war has started, and it's actually very unfortunate. If you remember 10 years ago, the end of November, Ukrainians were the first European country, so to say, who demonstrated in favor of European values. At that time, Maidan started, and the first European flags were up on Maidan and around Khreshchatyk and around many other cities in Ukraine. And I have been there, and I was surprised to see how many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians through all generations were very much committed to say, hey, we have chosen our path. We don't want to go back to the old so-called Russian Empire, to this old Soviet structure. We are pretty sure we belong to the European Union. And at that time, there was no open offer. There was no appetite. There was no readiness from the European side. So it took a full invasion. It took a full war and a lot of blood and a lot of victims until the European Union had decided then in June last year to grant the candidate status to Ukraine. And of course, it was a little bit cynical for many Ukrainians to say, hey, we are the biggest geographical state, European state, and only after we had suffered so much, we are considered to be a candidate country. But even despite this terrible war and the resources which had to go, and András and Alexandra have said that in the last month in this war, which is still absolutely unclear how this might end or in which favor, in which direction this might go, Ukrainians have undergone significant reforms, and that is important to understand. In June last year, the European Union formulated 7 so-called recommendations. And as Ursula von der Leyen has stated in her speech, which she gave last weekend in front of the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, she spoke about the 90% which were fulfilled. And to be honest, I was really very much astonished and also impressed during my visits how ambitiously the colleagues in the Rada, but also all the other Ukrainian institutions, took this recommendation seriously and really worked along this recommendation to fulfill them under this very difficult circumstances. So what we have seen is, and also what Ursula von der Leyen had mentioned, was that the anti-corruption reform, the reform of High Council of Justice, media legislation, and the legislation on national minority were of particular progress. I will come back to the minorities a little bit later, but it is important to see that those reforms have really been implemented. The second point where I would say there's a little bit more room for maneuverment is the multi-level governance. Ukraine is as resilient as they are because they had implemented the decentralization reform with 90 million euros coming from the EU after Maidan. So we have in each and every oblast, we had or we have an EU office, and we have given a lot of competences to the local self-government. And that was one of the, I would say, guarantees for Ukrainian citizens, how they can build up resilience and protection on the ground. And that is, to be honest, or has been abolished partly by Zelensky and his team. Also, of course, it was portrayed as necessary under the martial law, but I would say it was mainly to consolidate his own power in Kiev. So in that respect, I think we need to see more ambition to come back to this decentralized structures which worked perfectly before the war. There it has also a lot to do with the security situation. Then with the anti-corruption framework, the institutional framework, the two new heads for the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, so-called SAPO, and the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, so-called NABU, were appointed in July 2022 and March 2023. So that was also for the first time that we saw high-level corruption cases being targeted, such as Igor Kolomoisky. Many people had doubts, me included, whether this would be possible, especially due to the personal ties from Kolomoisky during his election campaign and Zelensky himself and his team. But that, indeed, he had proved that it is possible. Regarding fundamental rights, Ukraine generally complies with all international human rights instruments and has ratified most of the international conventions on the protection of fundamental rights. Here, let me emphasize that the International Criminal Court statute, Ukraine has not ratified yet. And it's an interesting debate going on, while actually all the respective institutions, such as the General Prosecutor, the Rada, the committees here, many other NGOs were very much in favor. And it's interesting to see who's actually blocking this, while this would be very much in favor of Ukraine bringing those cases, these huge cases of war crimes to the International Criminal Court. Then we see internal market cluster is key to Ukraine's preparation for requirement of the EU's internal market and is highly relevant to the implementation of the DCTFA. And also here, Ukraine has made significant progress in the areas of free movement of capital and intellectual right. On the green agenda, we see there's a lot of potential, of course. And it will be interesting, it will be crucial also here during the reconstruction phase to really promote a green agenda, to see how you can work here together with decentralized structures to make sure that renewables, that new structures, that new energy supplies get installed in the region, and also how you can decarbonize Ukraine from the scratch. But of course, that is something for the future, not at the moment. We talked about the very likely attacks on the energy infrastructure during winter times. So, and now my last point is what Alexandra has mentioned as well, the spoiler in the game when it comes to national minorities will be definitely Viktor Orban again. He has used the Hungarian minority during the last weeks to blackmail the EU. Ukraine has come back and has stressed the minority rights, especially in the Zakarpattia region. And I mean, if you compare the minority rights of the Hungarian minorities in Ukraine, I think you hardly can find any minority which is that protected and which has this extensive rights than the Hungarians in Zakarpattia. So here we see clearly a linkage between Viktor Orban using this case for his own domestic goals. He wants to unfreeze his funds, which we have frozen in the European Parliament and the European Union, then really to help his own minority in the Zakarpattia Mountains. So this would be my small introduction here.
Thank you very much, Viola von Cramon, for these insights and for elaborating on some aspects of a very large and long report indeed. And there's a lot that we could pick out and discuss. As people are getting their questions in the audience ready, allow me to ask a quick follow-up question, perhaps to Alexandra von Nahmen and Viola von Cramon, because if we look at domestic debates across the EU, the discussion on enlargement is not very present at all in most European member states. Even in France and Germany, it's mostly taking place on the higher political levels, if at all, and not even in parliament really, and in the media, except in Ukraine, of course, and in this very briefing that we're having at the moment. So I'm wondering, what does this tell us about the chances of success? If each of you could give a short answer to this question. I see that András is already fielding questions in the chat, but I would encourage our audience in the meantime to raise their hands and ask their questions right after this. So let's go in reverse order. Start with Viola and then Alexandra.
A very good question, and I definitely regret this, because for me it is also a question: what would happen if we do not get ready to enlarge the EU? What would this mean if we leave Ukraine alone, if we would leave the Western Balkans where they are? So for me, this is crystal clear. Stability and peace we can only achieve if we manage to bring those countries, of course, in a reformed manner, into the European Union. It's a merit-based process, this is no question, but I think we should really communicate to our citizens, to our people, why enlargement is the key question for the next years to come. If people object this, if they think this is just a thing, a matter of money, if this is just spreading their taxes around the world, and if this is not being understood, why the security question is very closely linked to this enlargement question, I think this could go in the wrong direction. And we see that parties such as the AfD and other right-wing parties use this enlargement ticket to manipulate public spaces and to spread false information, to make sure the population is rather turning against that. And that is, for me, a very dangerous development.
Mm-hmm. Alexandra von Nahmen, maybe the media has a role to play in this as well.
I think that, of course, you cannot blame the people for not being occupied with this topic, because they are consumed by other important issues that have a direct impact on their lives, the cost of living crisis. Migration is on the minds of many people. Climate change, the economic impact of Russia's war in Ukraine. So I think, I'm sorry, now there's like construction work. Sorry about that. It's the job of our politicians to raise this topic and to explain why it is important now to speak about enlargement, and why, after so many years of fatigue, this topic is at the top of our political agenda.
Thank you. We have a question from Christoph Rodolph, please.
Thank you. Yes, I don't want to bypass the chat discussion, but if you ask me a question to Alexandra von Nahmen, I was quite, so to say, neutrally impressed by your pessimistic outlook on the Western support, on the that can be expected. And it seemed, at least to my ears, that we are rather outspoken on that pessimistic view. How does that fit into the enlargement discussion, and what would be supportive action to keep up that Western support? Because that is critical, and we know the media spins and other factors that, and we know the democracy pitfalls to fall into those loops and get that negative spin. So what is your positive or optimistic recommendation to counter that possibility of fading Western support?
Yes.
Thank you for the question. And that gives me also the opportunity to maybe make a few points clearer. I was speaking about growing fears that indeed the Western support might be waning, and we see some indications for that. At the same time, of course, if we say that there are figures and political actors are now speaking about the need for an exit strategy, whether we speak about the Republicans in US Congress or whether we are speaking about some parts of some politicians in the European Union. What I was trying to explain in my introductory remarks was the real risk that might happen, that Zelensky indeed in the end, as the war drags on and the West and the European Union, their partners, his partners there are getting tired and more tired of what's happening in Ukraine, that he might face more and more calls to indeed enter talks with Russia, and there are some scenarios how Ukraine could be. I'm not rewarded is the wrong word, but how they could still be brought closer to the West and to the European Union. This is, of course, their well-nurtured goal and dream for so many years. So I think that is why it's so important to give them a real perspective when it comes to joining the European Union. And that is why I think that it was so important yesterday to send this positive political signal to Kiev that the European Union is not only talking about and praising Ukraine for fighting for our values, but that the European Union is also willing to welcome them one day as a member of their own club. So I think that could be, and that is indeed a scenario that is being discussed at some places, whether it is in Brussels or other European capitals, what kind of future Ukraine could have within the European Union, maybe even within NATO, if there must one day maybe say, yes, now we need to find a solution that we are not finding on the battlefield.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, Viola, come on if you want to come in.
Yeah, just very quickly. To be honest, I mean, the elephant in the room is the election in Washington. And if this goes in the wrong direction, which is very likely at the moment, if I look at the swing states, I think there is not a serious debate, at least not in public, how we're going to deal with this. And what does it mean, not just for the support of Ukraine, which would have, I don't know, a lot of political and military and financial impact, but also what does this mean for the security in Europe. And therefore, I'm actually joining Alexandra in her pessimistic outlook. I'm very worried, to be honest, and this is exactly what Putin is waiting for. Scholz does not take over anything. He is not ready to go in the lead. He is very reluctant when it comes to certain weapon categories. I've heard different strange stories, really conspiracy stories of why his inner circle refuses to support Ukraine fully. This does not go in the right direction, and I'm absolutely convinced if President Biden wants to be re-elected, he wants to be re-elected not as a war president. So he will step by step phase out of the military and the financial support. He tries to get this last package now with the 56 billion euros through the Congress, and then the next step will be to make sure Ukrainians are satisfied with what they have, and now they will be forced, not openly, but very much behind the scene, they were forced into any kind of negotiations. And that, I think, has direct consequences also for us in the European Union. And actually, we have no answer to this. This is not just about Slovakia. This is especially about the bigger capitals such as Berlin, Rome, and Paris. And they have to come up with a plan, and they haven't so far.
Thank you. I was actually just about to bring up the looming US elections, because if we assume that there's not going to be any movement whatsoever from the Russian side until the US elections, because of course from Putin's perspective, time is on his side, and waiting for a potential election of someone unlike Biden might actually play into his hands, then this just prolongs the war in itself. And I was wondering if perhaps you, András, could comment on the military consequences of this rationale in the background, playing for time from the Russian side. But perhaps, András, you could also bring in this separate conversation that's been going on in the chat, because I don't think all of our members in the audience are reading the chat. Perhaps you could just say a few words on the question, I think, was on North Korean weapons on the battlefield. So US elections and weapons, András.
Thank you. There was a question in the chat about the scale and importance of North Korean weapons, artillery shells already delivered to Ukraine, and whether the European Union could keep pace with it. The answer in the short run is clearly no. North Korea has the world's largest stockpiles of heavy artillery pieces, more than 6,000 different heavy artillery systems, with dozens of millions, possibly hundreds of millions of artillery shells produced basically since the Korean War. So North Korea has immense supplies. In 2 months' time, they delivered roughly around 600,000 or 1 million shells to Russia, around 300,000 to 500,000 per month, and the shipments are continuing. The European Union as a whole has still been discussing, as it was said by the colleagues before, about the possibility of delivering 1 million shells altogether, if ever we'd be able to do it. North Koreans have did so in 2 months, and they are continuing it. So these North Korean ammunition shipments allow Russia to again intensify artillery strikes, particularly used in defense operations and small-scale assaults like it's happening in Avdiivka. So these North Korean arms shipments help Russia to prolong the conflict. And even if they are unable to conquer any larger Ukrainian territories anymore, because the Russian army has been bled out. This army is not able to conduct any strategic scale offensives anymore. They will not take Zaporizhia, they will not take Kharkiv, they will not take Kherson. The front line is very, very likely to stay largely where it is at the moment. But still, these arms shipments allow Russia to strengthen its defense to a significant extent. So make the life or the perspectives of Ukraine liberating more territories a lot more complicated. When it comes to Russia is clearly following a strategy of outweighting and outlasting the West. The Russian calculus is that they can continue fighting longer than the West can. Their strategy is not to break Ukraine. Ukraine has to fight anyways. Their strategy is to break the Western support behind Ukraine. Because once Western support is broken, Ukraine would lose the war in months, possibly in weeks. And of course, there is no such thing like collective West that could be broken all at once. But weakening the support coming from crucial Western states that may have a devastating effect on Ukraine's ability to continue fighting. When it comes to the US elections, in the short run, one needs to see clearly that even if elections take an unfortunate direction and a certain former president returns to power, the first time when a new Trump administration can take any decisions is late January 2025, because this is when they get inaugurated. So we have more than a year still of the Biden administration, and so far the support seems to continue. The US armed forces still have significant supplies that could be delivered to Ukraine. Moreover, newer and newer weapon systems are also getting deployed. During our field trips, or my field trips in Ukraine recently, I have not heard any decisive concerns about even of the Trump administration. I mean, one needs to remember that it was actually the first Trump administration which started to deliver lethal weapons to Ukraine from 2016 on. The Obama administration did not do so. So I wouldn't take it automatic and granted that even if a Trump administration comes to power, Trump would immediately cut the support to Ukraine. From former President Trump, we have seen very different turns in foreign policy and very different declarations. So kind of a pre-election campaign statements that he would put the war to an end in 1 day's time, these I wouldn't take too seriously. The concern is there, but it's not acute. Second, the track record of the Trumpist administration on Russia and military support for Ukraine is actually not that bad. So in the short run, I'm fairly confident on the sustained US support. I hope this helps. One more thing when it comes to Slovakia, details matter here. In the election campaign, Fico said not a single bullet to Ukraine anymore. This week, the new Slovak foreign minister already clarified that in fact it meant that no new deliveries from Slovak stockpiles to Ukraine for free. But the Slovak defense industry is further encouraged to continue producing weapons for Ukraine and to contribute weapon systems which are jointly produced by other countries. So the situation is not as simple as it was said. In the election campaign, Slovakia will continue to deliver the Zuzana self-propelled howitzers and a lot of other weapon systems. And when it comes to the existing Slovak stockpiles of weapons, those have already been mostly depleted, thanks to the very early commitment of the previous Slovak government to the case of supporting Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So the situation is not tragic at all. One really needs to go for the details. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this. And of course, as Viola is pointing out in the chat, there's also the threat of another round of Russian mobilization. There are several comments by Rebecca Harms in the chat, pointing in the direction of lack of unity in the West, in the EU and NATO, and also pointing the finger at certain countries that are obstacles to more unity. I wonder if perhaps Rebecca Harms, you would like to elaborate, or our speakers want to address this. I did have another question that I wanted to throw out there, because as we're talking about EU expansion, we know, of course, that being in the EU doesn't solve all questions at once, as we've seen in the context of rule of law in places like Hungary or Poland. So I'm wondering, how can the EU ensure not to lose track of its core principles as it is getting ready to expand? And indeed, this is one of the things that came out in the debate about the Commission report in the past couple of days as well. And I see there's another longish comment in the chat, which I'm not able to read at the same time, but let's start with these questions first. So addressing lack of unity, and at the same time, not losing track of core principles in the EU. Perhaps Alexandra von Nahmen, would you like to go first?
Sorry, I was a bit distracted reading the longer questions in the chat. Yeah, I mean, I think that what's maybe important just to stress once again is that we, as Europe as the West, if I may say so, or let's put it in more general and objective way, the European Union and the West has remained united and determined to supporting Ukraine for such a long time. And I'm sure that surprised Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. And I covered him a lot during my time in Moscow because, of course, as you pointed out, he's trying to wait us out. And to see weakness and waning support for Ukraine. So, I mean, we should just stress it one more time because we tend to forget that nobody really believed that there will be such a strong unity among members of the European Union, even though we deal with some pro-Russian or Russian-friendly leaders still. With some of them, we don't need to name the names, we know all of them, who are trying to block further sanctions, who are also using the situation to blackmail the European Union to get what they want to get. But indeed, the longer the war continues, the more difficult it will be for members of the European Union to stay united. That has also to do with the economic situation in the bloc, with fears of ordinary citizens, and I think that with regard to many important issues, and as I was trying to explain, I think it's very important for our political class to be bold and to be not afraid of telling the truth and explaining why is it so important to support Ukraine. Why we should not fade? Why is it in our own interest to have a strong democratic country at our doorstep? So I think sometimes my impression is that some politicians are just so preoccupied with the problems that their constituents are facing that they are maybe not bold enough to present this bigger picture. And I think we can assume that people will understand what at stake here.
Milan Nitsch, our colleague and senior research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, has raised his hand, and I also see a long question by Georg Baumgarn. Perhaps you would like to ask this question in person afterwards, but please, Milan first.
Thank you, Jan. I just know how we encourage people to ask questions via video chat so that it's a more dynamic dialogue. So if there was no other volunteer, then I'm throwing my head here. And I have a question to both Viola and Alexandra. If they had the chance to look at the enlargement package, annual enlargement package published yesterday or endorsed, adopted by the Commission yesterday, especially the country report on Ukraine, and whether you see something tangible on the association process. So let's suppose that there is a positive decision of the European Council in December to start accession talks. Let's suppose that Hungary will not block such a decision over Hungarian minority in Transcarpathia. There's a side question to András, where this is, whether there is something new. But and then there is a screening and opening of accession talks with Ukraine during 2024. Do you see any sectors, any I'm looking at especially the economic side of this relationship, where Ukraine can access the European market? Is there any lessons learned from the grain export situation and the problems that the neighboring countries had with the amounts and the immediate competition of cheaper Ukrainian grains? So what there could be tangible for Ukrainian population next year from such a decision to start accession talks? And if there is any pointers by the European Commission where this could go next, in, I think what there is from the Commission side, a quite creative way how to move forward this, which is otherwise very stagnating accession procedure with the Western Balkans. I think on Ukraine, they're reinventing the wheel. And I wonder, it's a long report, but if you have seen something more tangible there.
Wonderful, excellent question, Milan. And since we only have 5 minutes left, I would like to encourage our speakers to use this as closing remarks at the same time. We'll go in reverse order: Viola von Cramon, Alexandra von Nahmen, and then András. And feel free to pick up any of the questions in the chat as well.
There was a direct question addressed to me in the chat, elaborating a little bit more what the conspiracy of the inner circle of Scholz has conveyed. I can go into this, that's not a problem. So the saying is that German weapons will provoke Putin to throwing the nuclear bomb, which is totally BS. Sorry to say, that is the only reason why. I mean, that is it's not a reason, but this is the argument why obviously Germans are so much reluctant to really go what would be necessary to, as Alexandra has said, Putin is a bully. And the only language he understands is the bully language. And to be reluctant, to be cautious, to try to come up with a new cooperative approach will never work. So the only thing which Putin fears is that he gets defeated. And he gets defeated, that would also mean we can have, or we could see some changes in Russia. And that's why the Russian opposition, that's why Lev Gutkov, the head of the Levada Center, in his interview of the week last week, said very explicitly, we have to make sure that Putin gets defeated. We were too shy in Georgia. We were too shy in 2014 on Ukraine, on Crimea. And now again, I mean, if he goes away with this full-scale invasion, we cannot imagine what he might come up with for the northern Baltic states and so on. He tries in a hybrid way already to destabilize our society in a very severe way. But when he, in case he would be successful and he would succeed in Ukraine, I think the security in Europe would be threatened in a different way. And there, I think nobody is really ready for. Exactly as Alexandra said, nobody is ready to explain this to our citizens, and nobody gets ready. Now, maybe with Pistorius' Kriegstüchtigkeitsdebate, there might be a slight change in the discourse, but for my experience, it's not enough. When it comes to the question of integrating Ukraine into the EU, I think in energy terms, Ukraine had already started to become an integral part of the EU. Of course, with the heavy shelling of the energy infrastructure is becoming increasingly difficult. Grain could be much better integrated. I don't want to go into details, but most of the objection came from the Polish campaign. There was a domestic issue to go against Ukrainian grain. Many Polish traders actually hoarded Ukrainian grain and then tried to resell it for a higher price. So there was a speculation gains and stuff like this. So maybe this would be worth going for a separate session to rather focus on why Ukraine could be an asset in economic terms for the EU as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexandra von Nahmen.
Thank you. To the question itself, I don't have much to add. I would also say that apart from the fact that just sending this signal, we are recommending opening of accession talks with Ukraine, which was an important signal, as we said, a key milestone. Going through the report, and we're still doing this point by point, you see some possibilities, as Viola just mentioned, whether it's energy or other things with regard to a gradual access to the single market. There are possibilities for the European Commission to be innovative and to try ways to gradually get Ukraine closer to the European Union once the leaders will say yes to the recommendation. And I think we started with or it was Viola that started reminding us of Ukraine's long way and long fight for being part of the West of the European Union. And I as well was at the Maidan covering the protests at that time 10 years ago. So I think that this is just the path that we would need to continue for our own security and for our own interests, but also on behalf of Ukraine, strengthening the democratic principles in Ukraine and giving people their hope that the European Union supporting that it's just not empty words, but it's substance, and that the European Union is determined to stay credible.
András, here's the last word.
Thank you. Two very short things. Yes, I fully share Milan's concerns. Hungary may very well actually veto the December Council decision on starting that session talks with Ukraine. The political director of Viktor Orban, another Orban, Balázs Orban, but it's unrelated, he already said that as long as Ukraine doesn't make significant changes in the minority rights of ethnic Hungarians in Ukraine, Budapest could not support the accession talks. There are small gestures taking place already on the Ukrainian side. So Ukraine is trying to tackle the challenge so far by political gestures. Any larger scale changes in the minority-related legislations, particularly in the remaining short time, is extremely unlikely. Second thing, on the Russian escalatory steps, one of the results of the previous DGAP field trip to Ukraine has been to establish the conclusion that Russian escalatory steps in the war are not dependent on Western military shipments at all. Russia escalates when the military developments make it necessary from Russia's perspective to escalate. There is no correlation between the delivery of Leopard tanks or the Storm Shadow missiles or any weapon systems and the Russian escalatory steps. These are just two different dynamics. It's unlikely to change in the future either. Thank you.
We will have to come back to these questions in mid-December by the latest, and there are many more questions lined up. So please stay tuned and come to our next sessions of the weekly morning briefings. Let me just thank our panelists again, Viola, Alexandra, and András. It was a pleasure to have you. Thank you to our own audience for coming and asking crisp and intelligent questions. Have a lovely day, everyone. Bye-bye.